27 people who RSVP'd this evening, and we're at 25 right now, I'm showing, that joined. So to honor everybody's time, we're going to start. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of Wind 101 with Peter Sinclair. My name is Kathy Jo Vanderlaan, and I'm part of the 4-member Rural Economic Development Team at the Right Place and feet on the street for Montcalm County. Tonight's session is sponsored by the Montcalm Economic Alliance, or the MEA, and is part of a series of discussions and presentations focusing on alternative energy. Now, you may or may not know, and why is my slide not advancing? There we go.
There you go.
You may know that Michigan is broken up into 10 prosperity regions. Now, the West Michigan region, Region 4, encompasses 13 counties, including 6 that the Right Place directly serves. The MEA signed a contract with the Right Place to provide economic development services in 2015, and we're now in the 6th year of that relationship. So I know many of us are in a Zoom climate now because of what we're facing, but before we begin, I want to provide some housekeeping rules for some of those who may not be quite as familiar. You'll be muted during the sessions in order to limit the background noise. We'll utilize the mute all feature as needed. Leave the video display in speaker view. That's on your top right, so you'll always see Peter's presentation. And we have about 25 attendees, as I mentioned, in the session tonight. So please send any questions using the chat feature, which is near the bottom center of your screen, and Rob will facilitate the Q&A later. We're going to do our best to keep this roundtable to about an hour and a half max. However, should the discussion still be going at the end of the time frame, we might continue. And if any time you need to exit the meeting, feel free to do so. We'll be following up with all the attendees with a link to the recording so you can view this later. And if you feel unsure using the chat feature, just let us know you have a question near the end after Peter's done with his presentation, and we'll unmute you and call on you to ask the question if that's easier for you. And with that, I'd like to introduce our Montcalm Economic Alliance chairperson, as well as the Montcalm Planning Commission member, Rob Spohr, who will moderate the evening. Rob, take it away.
Thanks, Kathy Jo. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm sure you had better things to do, but then again, during this time, maybe not. Maybe this is a refresher for you. My name's, as Kathy Jo said, my name's Rob Spohr. I'm chair of the Montcalm Economic Alliance. I'm vice president for academics at Montcalm Community College. And I'm also sit on the Montcalm Planning Commission and the West Michigan Regional Planning Commissions. Every year in February and March, the Montcalm Planning Commission does trainings for local members, local townships. And this year was no different, but before we got our trainings in, you know what happened, we got COVID. So being engaged between the Montcalm Economic Alliance and the Planning Commission, we talked about what are some things we could do since everyone's at home to do some training for the area, do some presentations to keep people engaged on what's going on. We decided that we had already had one presentation, the MEA did earlier this year on solar, and we decided that we would follow this up with what you're here today to see, which is Wind 101. So our goal at the MEA is to improve the lives of everyone who lives in Montcalm County. Those of us in the MEA, we support renewable energy production in Montcalm County because businesses are demanding it. That's one of the things you're going to hear tonight, that many businesses, wherever they're going to locate, they want renewable energy that they can use. And also, renewable energy in an area like Montcalm County, it generates a lot of revenue to help fund public services like schools, law enforcement, and services for senior citizens. And you're going to see a little bit of that as well. The big thing is we want to make sure that everybody makes up their own mind. So we want to bring accurate information to you so you can make up your own mind, whether you agree with us or not. When you start asking around, you know, who can we get accurate information from? One of the first names you hear is Peter Sinclair. Peter is a lifelong Michigander. He's also an independent videographer based in Midland. We won't hold that against you, Peter. His work focuses on energy and environmental issues, and he's been working to communicate reliable information around renewable energy, wind and solar for many years. So I will now shut up and I will turn it over to Peter for our presentation today.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm gonna try to share a screen here and make sure that it is working. Okay, I think. Okay, and can everybody see a picture there of a big white blob?
Yes, sir.
Right, so I've been working as a videographer for a number of years, and in that capacity, over the last decade or so, have interviewed hundreds of the world's best known scientists and engineers and tried to communicate the message that they're sending. And what I'm most proud of is that they're happy enough with the work that I'm doing and the accuracy that I'm providing, that they've, over the last 8 or so years, began to invite me with them to places like you see on the screen there. That's the Greenland ice sheet, 3 times the size of Texas. We were there in 2018. I've actually been there about 7 times in the last 8 years. There was some members of our team up there. Here's the place where we camped at that particular time. I myself wanted to camp up here a little bit further by the waterfall, which was a mistake because I broke my ribs getting up there, but at least I had some nice white noise while I was writhing in pain that night. So I took a lot of Tylenol on that trip. But I was really pleased that the scientists were happy to have me along in my capacity as a media director of what we call the Dark Snow Project. And just FYI, as an independent videographer and not independently wealthy person, I am a consultant to a number of solar and wind developers around the state of Michigan and beyond to help better communicate in the face of a whole lot of misinformation that we know we are constantly seeing on the wilds of the internet. And so I try to bring the same commitment to accuracy to my messaging on renewable energy that I bring in my other work. So let's get started. A couple years ago, I was standing in the rain shooting pictures as the crews lifted one of the last rotors for this turbine here in Coe Township, Isabella County, which is part of the Pine River wind development, which is Michigan's newest. And I think this is really significant and speaks volumes because Coe Township, Pine River Township are right next door to the first large wind development that we've had here in mid-Michigan in Gratiot County. And these folks had most of a decade to kind of take the measure of what was going on over there and weigh the pros and cons. And they decided that this was something they wanted to be part of their community. And what's interesting to me and exciting is that areas to the north, south, east, and west of that original Gratiot development have all, after weighing those pros and cons, decided to move forward with wind energy. We're very excited right here in my neck of the woods, Midland County and Saginaw County, that we're looking forward to a new wind development right here, which we hope will start in just a few months. So with that being said, it turns out that Michiganders as a whole are very much in favor of renewable energy. The Michigan State University took a poll about a year and a half ago examining this question, and it turns out that Michigan residents support the transition from coal to solar and wind-powered electricity. And in fact, in this era when we seem to be so divided we can't agree upon anything, about 86% of those responding to the survey favored wind. So wind is approximately as popular as mom and apple pie in Michigan, and only about 5% of the public strongly opposes the use of more wind energy. Although I will say I've probably been in a room where all that 5% showed up at the same time. They're pretty good at that. They're pretty organized and sometimes very vocal. But we should remember it's a minority. I want to talk a little bit about this transition we're going through. The way that we deliver electricity to people has been pretty much the same for about 120 years, but it's going through a massive change right now. If we think of the electrical grid as like a bicycle wheel and a power plant's at the center, and the spokes are all the transmission lines going around to all the rest of us and the things that we do with that electricity, that's very much like the way the grid has been for 100 years. And if something happens to those few large power plants, then we have big problems over wide areas. And that's why it's starting to make sense to move to a grid that looks less like a bicycle wheel and more like a web, more like the internet. And just as on the internet, where every one of our computers and cell phones is capable of storing, creating, and transmitting information, in this new electric grid, we will have hundreds, thousands, eventually millions of little nodes that will be themselves capable of storing, transmitting, and even generating their own power. And that's going to make a grid that is much more dynamic, much more resilient to blackouts, brownouts, or untoward events that may come forward. I do a monthly video for a group out of Yale University, and I'm going to start with one of those, about 6 minutes long, but it's my approach is to talk to people that know more than me and learn from them, and go to experts who know firsthand about the topic that I am examining. So you're going to see a couple of executives of large utilities here, our own Patty Poppy, CEO of Consumers Energy here in Michigan, as well as some others, David Sagow from a Minnesota utility, and a number of experts on utility issues from across the country that are going to examine this transition that's taking place right here in America's heartland.
You know, post-World War II, electric demand was at a huge steep incline. Farms were being electrified, factories were coming online, we were fueling this great economy, and we needed to build plants as fast as humanly possible. And the reliable, affordable fuel that was available widely was coal, and it did its job. But the formula has changed.
The coal fleet in the US is on average about 45 years old. And that's about getting to the end of their lifetime anyways. And when we built a lot of these things in the 60s and 70s, we had to build these massive plants to get the economies of scale to make electricity really cheap as electricity use was growing and growing and growing and growing and growing.
Demand flat at best, and if we do our job, it might even decline. The actual per capita usage can go down as buildings are more efficient, lighting's more efficient, HVAC's more efficient. We all know that. So given that, we have the opportunity of a generation to determine with what will we replace these big central station baseload power plants. We will replace them with modular renewables because it's smarter.
What we've seen in the past, especially 2 or 3 years, is a recognition of the impact of falling prices for wind, solar, and storage across the country.
If you don't have certainty in your demand curve, you don't want to take a big bet and overbuild a big power plant. And actually, without the increasing demand, that's just a cost that we would all bear. If we're going to build a gas plant, it's going to be 1,000 megawatts. That's the minimum, efficient size. And so that's That's the way we used to have to think about it. We don't have to think about it that way now.
Whenever these utilities go, to the capital markets to look for these things, it's hard to fund a gigawatt scale plant anymore. And we have, cheaper alternatives in smaller pieces.
And so if we can modularly add renewables, and we can modularly add those renewables to match demand more timely. At the right time, we can add the supply we need, 2 megawatts at a time.
Wind and solar are the cheapest form of energy available to us and in the electricity system in the US, full stop.
To be honest, 10 years or so ago, when wind was first being developed in the upper Midwest, it was a very disruptive resource for us. We weren't very good at predicting when the wind would blow. The transmission system really wasn't up to par to handle the intermittency of the wind. And quite frankly, it was wreaking havoc with the economics of our baseload coal plants. And so we didn't like it much in 2005, 2006 timeframe. Fast forward to today, we've gotten very good at predicting when the wind is going to blow. The transmission system is able to handle the intermittency of all of this wind. It has no emissions, it has no variable costs, it's relatively inexpensive. What's not to like?
Colorado, where I live, where Excel here is able to buy new wind and solar for less than the cost of continuing to run its existing coal plants. Situations like that are showing up even in Midwest, where Northern Indiana Public Service Company made a similar announcement and is procuring wind and solar to a similar end now as part of its new resource plan.
In the past, you would see that natural gas has been extremely competitive in the resource that you would want to select. But when you start competing and you see cost declines on these renewable resources, you now see them being chosen over these long-term natural gas units.
Everybody in the world has consistently for the last 10 years underpredicted the price declines in solar in particular, but also wind. And now we're seeing that happen with lithium-ion storage as well.
In the past, we've tended to think of our baseload resources, our coal resources, as baseload, and every other resource being supplemental to that, regardless of what it was. Well, that's been turned on its head now. I would suggest to you that wind is quickly becoming the new baseload. And to be viable going forward, all other sources of generation must be flexible enough to be supplemental to the wind. Kind of an exciting thing right now. And you get your mind around that, it makes a lot of sense what we start doing with our other assets and other resources and why we're so committed to the wind.
So I think that's a pretty good snapshot of what's going on and why. Because the Wall Street Journal tells us that global investment in wind and solar energy is outshining fossil fuels by about 2 to 1 in terms of investment globally. And that's in large part because wind and solar, according to MIT expert Francis O'Sullivan that they quote, wind and solar now represent the lowest cost option for generating electricity. To show you what that looks like, I have a graph that comes out annually from Lazard, which is a global accounting and consulting firm that puts out an annual report on the cost of new electrical generation. So everything to the right side of the screen is more expensive and everything to the left is cheaper. And what the graph shows you is that right now, as of 2019, wind is the cheapest source for new electrical generation just about anywhere in the United States. Solar coming up fast on the outside. Gas still competitive in many respects, but it's wind and solar that have had the really dramatic price drops that have continued even over the last year. And I should just mention that this analysis strips out all the subsidies. So this is all apples to apples comparison here. Here's another short vid that talks about how major corporations have learned about this and are now picking up contracts for renewable energy in order to save money and become more competitive.
From Walmart to General Motors, the titans of business are becoming some of the biggest buyers of renewable energy, such as wind and solar power. But the shift isn't all about becoming better stewards of the environment. CEOs are learning that going green is a good way to control costs.
The renewables have dropped in price to where they're very competitive to even natural gas.
The cost of wind and solar power has come down dramatically over the last few years, so buying power from a wind farm or a solar energy facility is actually cost competitive with buying fossil fuel generated power from the grid.
Wind power costs have plunged 66% since 2009, while the cost to install solar has declined 70% since 2010. For big companies, that's adding up to millions of dollars in savings. GM, which plans to get all of its power from clean energy by 2050, says it's saving $5 million a year worldwide using renewables.
But ultimately, our goal is to be powered 100% by clean, renewable energy.
When I speak to a lot of companies, particularly companies like Google, like an Amazon, they want no footprint. They want to have a renewable footprint. They want their utilities to do it. They certainly tell me coal is dead.
Solar has fallen roughly 80% since 2009. Wind has fallen 50%, such that both are now at or below conventional technologies unsubsidized.
Look at our renewable energy already, when how many jobs it has, the solar, wind, and bios. We're going to keep supporting that. This is Advantage America.
37% of our electricity production is done by renewables. The vast majority is done by wind and photovoltaics. And I can tell you what, the grid is extremely stable. We have grid disruption a year at about 12 minutes. So 12 minutes a year is effectively nothing.
If you said cost competitiveness for a customer is $45 per megawatt, something like that, that would be where we would say we got to hit that or lower. And I know that as a company, we've solicited and we've gone into contracts with wind facilities that are at that $45, $44 per megawatt cost. And that tells us that in reality, we can see these costs declining to competitive levels now. And if they continue to come in at those ranges, then they'll become more and more a resource that we would want to have for our customers.
Very good. So just to bring this right up to date, here we are in the corona crisis globally, but according to the Wall Street Journal, wind and solar farms are seen as haven in this crisis. They're attracting interest from investors looking for low risk, stable yields. Oil companies are having a terrible time right now, but wind and solar energy keep growing. They now produce energy more cheaply than natural gas and coal. And as the revenue has suffered during this time of downturn, the utilities want to use more of the wind and solar because they're not paying any fuel costs. And this is the news item that caught my eye just this morning. Financial Times says clean power stocks outperform fossil fuel peers during this pandemic. The clean power stocks rose 2% in the first 4 months of the year, while fossil fuels fell off 40%. So that tells you why investors are looking at renewables as a haven. And they found further, this was a group at Imperial College of London, that renewable power had a bit of a protective effect, which is something they did not know about, a protective effect on investment portfolios. And it looks like this year renewable energy is going to outproduce coal for electricity for the first time on record. And the grid is changing much faster than anyone would have predicted even 5 years ago. And there are areas in parts of the country where we're seeing on some days, windy, sunny days, penetrations of 60 or 70% renewable energy. So I want to jump right into some of the questions that come right to people's mind when you talk about renewables. What happens when the wind stops? What happens when the sun goes down? And it turns out that, well, first of all, it's a myth that traditional types of power plants don't have to be backed up. You can't build a power plant in this country unless you can show what happens if that power plant breaks down or has to be repaired or refueled. And so we're very used to structuring our grid so that we can move demand around and handle unexpected incidents when they arise. And it turns out actually that the capacity to store renewable energy is something that we potentially can lead the world in right here in Michigan, based on facilities that have already been in place here for several decades. I talked to Wolfgang Bauer at Michigan State University, who described some of this, and you'll see this video also cuts back to Patty Poppy to talk about the pump storage, energy storage plant at Ludington, which a lot of people don't know about, but they're going to describe it to you here.
The remaining question is, of course, what do you do about energy storage, right? And fortunately in Michigan, this has been solved completely. We have the largest battery that I know of, at least in North America, here in Michigan, and it's called the Ludington Pump Hydro Storage Plant.
Ludington Pump Storage is the great engineering marvel, one of the great engineering marvels of the world. It is the 4th largest battery in the world. It has 6 units. I don't know how familiar you are, or if you've ever visited, but you should, because it's gorgeous. It's the most gorgeous power plant in the world. On the banks of Lake Michigan, pumps water up into a 27 billion gallon reservoir, and we have the 6 largest motors in the world. Each unit has a 500,000 horsepower motor. And those 6 largest motors in the world pump the water up. They power the pumps that take the water up into the reservoir. And then when we need the power, those motors rotating in reverse generate electricity. 2,200 megawatts of carbon-free, emission-free, clean, pure Michigan power. Today, we fill the reservoir once a day. But when we have fully deployed those 5 and then 6,000 megawatts of solar, we'll have excess power in the day. California is dealing with this, and they're concerned about what do you do with extra power in the daytime.
In Arizona these days, between the hours of 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., we get negatively priced electricity from California. There's so much solar being produced in California, they can't use it all. They push it to Arizona during those hours and pay our utilities to take it off the grid.
And guess what we're going to do with it? We're going to pump and fill the reservoir at Ludington. And then we're going to use that reservoir to serve the peak load. And then at night, our wind farms generating extra electricity will also then refill the pond, and we're going to get to refill that pond twice a day because of the upgrade we've done on those motors. That is exciting. That doubles the capacity of that battery for the service of people of Michigan and the inclusion then in our clean energy plan.
So it turns out that Michigan is actually in a position to lead the world in this renewable energy transition if we have the will to do it. So that's what it looks like at sort of the 50,000 foot level, but I wanted to find out what does it look like for people that actually have wind energy in their community. And I've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years talking to local citizens, local officials who are living in those wind turbine communities. And I've got a few videos here that give us a little bit of a slice of what their responses have been. What has the impact of the local wind development been on the local school districts?
The wind development has been significant. It's allowed us to keep program funding roughly the same level, and we haven't had to decrease funding as other ISDs have had to do in economic downturn. It's allowed us to keep programs whole. Been a lot of benefit to our local community.
In our township, last year we charged residents 1.75 mils per fire protection. With the turbines coming on this year, we dropped it to 1 mil. And so every taxpayer is saving at least 3/4 of a mil just on the township fire department.
And even the farmers that decided not to get into the wind agreement have come back and said maybe they should have.
Since we've had the turbines for the last 8 years, there's no evidence to support any lower property values.
Last year alone in Bethany Township, Residential increased 16.6%. On the residential homes, the year before, I think it was 7, and the year before that, 10.
I've never seen any dead birds under any of the turbines.
We hear that, you know, they're killing the birds, but yet show us the dead birds, I guess.
I mean, I don't need extra police because I've now got $90 million worth of turbines. I don't need extra fire department. I don't have ambulance calls. I don't have to build schools because somehow they bring kids with them. They just sit there and provide a benefit of life and a quality of life for everyone else.
The township and the senior citizens and everybody else had to do nothing. They didn't need to build a road. They didn't need to construct a center. They didn't need to do anything. They didn't need to put in a power line. All they needed to do is add a line on their tax forms, and the money just comes rolling in.
I would say we had no controversy, and I don't think that makes Gratiot different than others. I think it's just, it was familiarity with the project, that they had seen them and said, well, others may have concerns, but for the most part, they just sit there and do what they say they're going to do. They build them, they turn, they produce electricity, they pay some taxes to our schools and our county and our township, and yeah, they're a neighbor.
So that's a collection of officials, and you heard Kevin Beeson there talk about how he was able to lower the millage for the fire rescue, and we're going to talk about that coming up too. But this is some interview footage with another expert, Sarah Mills, who is a researcher at the University of Michigan, who's developed a national reputation for her studies of the relation between wind farms and the communities they are in.
In communities that had wind farms, those people that were receiving wind farm income were more likely to say that they were going to pass their farm on to a child, or that they had developed a succession plan and they knew who they were going to pass their farm on to. In comparison to the other places where they said that either they didn't have a succession plan in place, or the more likely outcome was that they were going to just sell their land to a neighboring farmer. We see that a lot in agriculture, so farms get bigger and bigger. What that means is that farming communities, the towns that support them, get smaller and smaller, and so you see rural schools closing or consolidating. And so I have evidence that in these farming communities, a younger generation of farmers is staying on the farm. Now, why would a younger generation of farmers be staying on the farm? How does a wind turbine help that? What I've heard is that this is a way for them to diversify their farm income. So younger farmers see this as not such a risky business. They know that they're going to have a guaranteed revenue stream for the next 20 years that's drought proof. And so they see this as an opportunity.
Yeah, and I've got plenty more videos from Sarah that we can talk about later. But one of my favorites is this interview I did with Jeff Westall, who is the fire chief in Breckenridge and Wheeler Township. And I went over to see him. It's a topic that's somewhat dear to my heart because I was a paramedic myself for 10 years in Midland County, and I know this work fairly well. But Jeff had a lot of things to say about the benefits that have come since wind revenue was available in his area.
I love being the fire chief here at Breckenridge. I've been an officer on the department for roughly 15 years, and I've just slowly worked my way up. It's a family to me. It's my second family. With windmill funding, we've been able to buy a lot of stuff for the department. We just got a 2019 fire truck with the funding. We've been able to buy a lot of equipment that we wouldn't have been able to buy.
Wind turbines have provided a lot of extra revenue for our township. They've provided us with about almost $60,000 extra a year for our roads. They provide us about $150-some thousand annually for our fire rescue department, and another $60,000 for just general township revenue that we use in our budget.
We've been able to upgrade all of our appliances to new. We've been able to get all brand new hose for the truck, all brand new nozzles for the truck. It's helped outstanding for our community, for our fire department alone. I've been on 21 years. We've always got hand-me-down stuff. And for the last 5, 6, 7 years since the windmills, we've just been upgrading, it seems like yearly, our new equipment. Fundings from the windmill made it possible to buy this truck. It's been in service for us for about 2 weeks now. This is very reliable compared to our old grass trucks that we've had in the past on the fire department. So this is our Polaris Ranger. We also use this to fight field fires, forest fires. This will carry another 5 to 6 firefighters also. It has a 55-gallon tank of water on the back of it that we can use to help extinguish the fire. We've had issues in the past where the old units just didn't start up, so they weren't reliable. And so with the extra money that we've had coming in for years now, our board was grateful enough to let us order a brand new 2019 Chevy pickup. So we also train yearly with the local windmill companies. They'll do it like a person might have a cardiac arrest up in the tower. They start the rescue efforts of bringing them down via rope. We officially take over when they're on the ground. We've been very fortunate where we have responded to 0 incidents with the windmill companies here. One of our local windmill companies, Invenergy, also donates $2,500 to us every year for the fire prevention program when we put it on for the school kids, which makes it very nice. You always remember. You remember every scene. You remember every scene. It doesn't matter, street corner, house, accidents, when you go by it, they always come back into the back of your memory. We're just not out fighting fire, helping people with rescues. We're out there. We volunteer to help the community out. If they need yards raked, we're volunteering to rake yards for them. They give to us with their millage, so why not give back to them?
So I really enjoyed Jeff and hearing that perspective. Another question that you hear constantly is, what about these renewable energy sources? I heard that that's just a bunch of government subsidized stuff, and it wouldn't exist without government subsidies. Well, I wanted, as I like to do, I like to talk to experts, and I found one that some of you may actually be familiar with if you're History Channel buffs. Marty Lagina is a Michigan boy, went to college, became an engineer, then went to law school, and in the course of, while he was still in school, started an oil and gas company, which he sold a few years later for a lot of money, and then he decided to get into solar and wind. And so he's been doing solar and wind now for a decade or more. And so I figured, here's a guy, not only does he know the energy industry front to back and side to side, he's got himself a hit TV show. So he's probably a pretty talented, pretty passionate guy. I happened to run into him up in Traverse City, and I asked him this question about this whole business about subsidies for renewable energy.
That whole business about wind is a joke and wouldn't work without government subsidies actually was past tense, probably true when I started. I'll just be candid. We got in it out of a sense of environmental sense, yes, but also because we wanted to make money, and without the government subsidies, I don't think we would have done it. But that subsidy drove technology. It caused people to build these machines. It caused people to put these machines out. And when you put a machine out, I'm a mechanical engineer. If you put a machine out of a certain size and type and you run it, the engineers always do this. They say, wow, if we only did this, if we only did that, we lengthen the blades, we put a different generator in, we make the tower higher, we make the tower lighter. And so this subsidy drove that. It drove technology. Fundamentally and philosophically, I don't like government subsidies. I wish they would all go away. I'm a free market guy. But here's the problem. They exist all over the place. There is no level playing field. So yeah, wind came in and got a subsidy. My background, as I've said, is in oil and gas. Natural gas has subsidies. Oil drilling has subsidies. Coal has subsidies. Nuclear has subsidies. Wind, in about 2 years, will be the only energy generation form that I'm aware of that will have no direct subsidy. And I am convinced now, in the 10 or 12 years I've been doing this, that it went from, yes, needed to be subsidized, was kind of a marginal thing, to being pretty much disruptive. If we can get over the political issues, wind is probably going to be the cheapest new electrical generation of anything for the foreseeable future.
And I know some people that would probably say, watch out for solar, because that's coming too. But here's one of the most pernicious and really, I think, misleading types of misinformation that you see out on the internet, is that wind energy possibly has some kind of health effects. And again, I was fortunate enough to be able to connect with one of the global experts on this issue. Actually, Jeffrey Ellenbogen is a physician. He is a neurologist. He is a graduate of the University of Michigan and Harvard. He was an instructor in neurology at Harvard several years ago, while he was also director of the Harvard Sleep Lab at Mass General Hospital. And in that capacity, he was asked by the Department of Public Health of the state of Massachusetts to conduct a year-long survey of the global literature of any health effects or lack thereof connected with wind power. And that's a very famous study that he chaired. And he has since then continued to follow the literature, survey the literature, and conduct his own studies now at Johns Hopkins University in his specialty of the effects of acoustic energy on the human organism. And he spoke not too long ago in Saginaw. I'm very fortunate to have some video of that talk. This is my longest video clip. It's about 8 minutes, but I think it's worth every second of it. So let's give him a listen here.
I'm a neurologist and a sleep specialist, both of those, and I worked for many years at Mass General Hospital, and then I worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I taught neuroscience at Harvard for many years, and so I had a good time with that. I care a great deal about the health implications of noise, and that's been my research platform for quite some time, is looking at the interface of signals with the brain and with human physiology to optimize human health and well-being. And so that's kind of my reason to be and my personal passion. In 2011, I was asked by the commissioners of, I was living in Massachusetts at the time, I was asked by the commissioners for the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Public Health to come join a 7-member committee that was going to evaluate the potential health impacts of wind on humans. What the commissioners wanted was, they said, well, Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts is going to make a big push for wind energy, but before we do that, we want to know what we're getting ourselves into. So we brought together a group of people, and we went over paper after paper for an entire year of deliberating it. It was both fun and incredibly painful. It was a lot of detail. We came out with a report. It's sometimes called the Massachusetts study, but it's a report. It's not a new research study. It's an evaluation of the existing research, the state of the science. And there were a couple of really big, high-level points that came out of it. First of all, the main point that we made, and this is now back in 2012, was that adverse health outcomes, claims about adverse health outcomes based on wind energy are not based on scientific or medical literature. There's no basis for that, and so people that are making that claim are not pointing to scientific or medical literature, and certainly not anything of good quality. We looked very carefully at something called wind turbine syndrome, which is out there, and it's one of the prominent things that shows up when you look at this. There is no such thing as wind turbine syndrome. We looked at, there's some scientists in Portugal that talk about vibrio acoustic disease. There's no such thing as vibrio acoustic disease. It just doesn't exist. It's not a real thing, and so on. We said if you make the turbines loud enough and you bring them close enough to people, it's going to start waking people up. It's going to annoy people that don't like them. But we noted that it's going to annoy people more if they feel that the turbine is affecting their health and safety, and who can blame them for that feeling. So the key is getting information right to help to reduce the feeling of annoyance that some people have from wind turbines, and to cite them in a reasonable way so that they don't wake people up. We didn't have a threshold at that time. We didn't know how to draw a line in the sand. We knew if you got very loud, you're going to wake people up. And so over a range of other health effects, cardiovascular disease, headaches, hearing loss, you name it, there's just no basis for the fact that a wind turbine would cause those kinds of health problems. Okay, that was 2012. I got a lot of hate mail from that, and as you can imagine, and I went through it. I took it very seriously. You know, the last thing that I want to do, the last thing anybody here wants to do, is not have compassion or concern for anyone. And so getting an email saying, how can you promise me that my child is not going to develop neuropathy because of the wind turbine that you said was okay, those are challenging emails to get. But fortunately, as time has gone on, those kinds of interactions that I've had with people, which often end in a, oh, okay, I didn't realize that that was just something made up on a website. More importantly than that, there has been some new scientific literature, the broadest and most comprehensive of which comes out of Canada. I'll colloquially call the Health Canada study, which I'll talk about in just a minute, that gave a lot of relief and a lot of data to support what we probably already knew. Health Canada is a study, again, the broadest, most comprehensive, and the only study that has looked at actual physiology of people. This is 1,200 some odd people in Prince Edward Island and Ontario. It's an enormous study. These are sited turbines, so this is a real house and a real turbine, and they asked a series of questions, numerous publications, surveys about cardiovascular disease, stress, headache, and so forth. And they matched this is the really great part, they matched the questionnaires that they were giving to people to actual physiological measurements. They measured the physiology of sleep. They measured the physiology of stress by checking cortisol levels. They measured cardiovascular health by measuring blood pressure, heart rate, and so forth, of real people living near real turbines that are spinning. And they measured the sound. And then they modeled the sound to each and every one of those houses. And they looked at the spread of them. So people that didn't have any reasonable noise exposure whatsoever, like I think it was less than 20 or 25 dBA, versus people all the way up to 46 dBA. That was the highest noise that they measured. It's not a line in the sand necessarily, but that's the loudest noise that they experienced in those regions. And they compared how people were doing their health in that high category to how the people were doing the health in the low category. Remembering that insomnia and hypertension and other diseases are common in the general population. The question is, does a wind turbine influence those things? And the answer was a blunt no. On all of the measures, the measures of questionnaires, stress, cardiovascular disease, sleep, and a broader range of medical health questions, there was not a greater risk or greater rate, a greater amount of those problems in the higher noise, excuse me, the higher noise categories, the people near turbines. Similarly, for the physiological measures, cortisol level for stress, blood pressure and heart rate for stress, and cardiovascular disease, sleep physiology, so forth. You get the kind of where I'm going with it. No element of that correlated to higher noise exposure closer to wind turbines. And so this is a really bold piece of information because there's something kind of intuitive about that, but it's really important to know that when someone says wind turbines are going to cause, and they list insomnia and heart attacks and stroke and diabetes, I think you have now not only a sense of intuition that that won't happen, but also a piece of information that's really important.
So I thought that was a really extraordinary talk that he gave in Saginaw last year, and I'm really pleased to be able to share that. But as some of you may know, not everybody wants clean energy, and there are individuals and groups that are organized by lobbying arms of the fossil fuel industry right out of Washington that have outreach in areas of the Midwest, and it's quite possible that they may show up in any place where a wind or solar is planned. And I've spent the last couple of years going to meetings, recording some of their tactics, and also because I happen to know some of the background information, putting that together in sort of a profile of what these folks are doing and what the tactics are that they are using. So this is about a 6-minute piece, and I think it's kind of vital for folks to just have a heads up as to what these tactics look like.
This is Jas Nolan, an attorney who is frequently involved in anti-renewable energy efforts in the Midwest. Here, Mr. Nolan addresses a board in Burlington Township, Michigan.
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir. No, I agree. It was Dave's time. Well, then just shut the hell up. It was Dave's original. All right, I'll call the meeting. Please do.
In January 2019, Mr. Nolan addressed the Isabella County, Michigan Planning Commission, which had just unanimously approved a wind farm permit, making what many listeners interpreted as a thinly veiled legal threat against the commissioners. Listen and see what you think.
I don't really do this type of work, but there will be other lawyers that will be lining up to take these cases on a contingency case. And they will be coming after the county. And, you know, if I was in their shoes, I'd be looking at Apex, Epsilon, the county, and each one of you. And I would really encourage the county to up its liability policy before you complete this project. Have a good night, guys. Thank you.
Intimidation comes in many forms. At a planning commission meeting in North Branch, Michigan, a farmer stands up to read an abusive letter he has received from an anti-wind activist.
David, you're up first. You were the first one. I would rather you didn't read that letter.
Well, you weren't here at the township.
I already read the letter.
So you only made your perception to read it?
You can read it if you choose. You think it's necessary. Please censor it.
Oh, I will. Did you read this letter? Yes. But anyways, I got that letter the day after Thanksgiving. Now I'm going to bleep out some of the words, but it shows you how degrading somebody is. It's pretty disturbing. But anyways, it's addressed to me. And then he says, then you must be one stupid blank idiot in the world, or you're just a stupid blank farmer. There's a liar and a cheater, and he blanks everyone over. We don't need bullies in our town to get out and take blank face with you. Bold letters that says no bullies allowed. Now, how would you like to get that letter the day after Thanksgiving? And it's unbelievable. So anyways, the opposition is being coached to put fear and intimidate people in the community.
On the other side of the state, in Casnovia, Michigan, a township supervisor recently described what happened as the board pondered a wind farm proposal.
I am proud and disappointed of our township. Most have come to these meetings calm and polite, even though we have our own perspectives on how this will affect our township. However, we have had some rude and disrespectful behavior. We've had vandalism at the town hall, we've had vandalism to our sign, and most recently, we've had some disrespectful behavior to one of our board members at the township hall. The township hall was closed Tuesday and Wednesday this week to avoid harsh conversations. During this meeting, outbursts of any remarks will not be tolerated. and threats to township officials will be prosecuted. I know it's tough, but we all need to behave.
Because these guys like this and this Keith Martis or Kevin Martis or whoever the hell he is on his social page has got that negativity, that fear factor, and that's what they're trying to send a message instead of going after the facts.
The name Kevin Martis is familiar to anti-renewable energy groups across the Midwest.
I'm also a senior policy fellow at E&E Legal Institute.
E&E Legal is a Washington, D.C. based lobbying group which receives substantial funding from the fossil fuel and coal industries. E&E Legal is nationally known over the past decade for a campaign of intimidation and bullying against scientists and academics across the country, like Malcolm Hughes of the University of Arizona.
I think psychologically it has a somewhat similar effect to living in a police state, because you learn to be extremely careful about what you say where, in a way that stilts and stunts the free expression that needs to take place in an intellectually combative field like science.
For his part, Mr. Martis denies receiving any compensation from the fossil fuel industry for his extensive work and travel over many years.
And I'm not a paid lobbyist, and I donate my time. Sometimes people give me an honorarium.
Recently, on his Facebook page, Mr. Martis posted a recipe for anti-renewable energy activists who wish to influence township and county officials. He writes, "Your county commissioners will not be moved by facts. They will be moved by political fear. If your plan for success involves urging the county government to take steps that require some blend of courage and intelligence, you will lose." For whatever reasons, Kevin Martis, Josh Nolan, and others like them continue to work against the best interests of farmers, families, and communities in rural America, and against the well-being of future generations of Americans. But across the Midwest, the transition to renewable energy is only picking up steam. As more and more Americans step up to demand real energy independence with power that is clean, inexpensive, abundant, and ensures our children's future.
So, the good news is that despite all that bluster, all across mid-Michigan, people they listen to the negatives, they look at the actual lived experience that they can see that their neighbors are having just next door, and they've decided to go ahead with wind energy more and more. And a pretty good example is Isabella County. Right now, the first components are arriving in Isabella County for what is going to be Michigan's largest wind farm there very soon. And at the time that was being permitted in Mount Pleasant, January 31st, 2019, there were a number of public comments, a number of community members who came out in favor of that project. But I think none of them was as eloquent as a simple farmer, John Fabian. And I think you'll see why when I play his remarks here, why he received a standing ovation and brought the house down.
Hello, my name is John Fabian, 6531 East Vernon Road, Rosebush, and my family is in support of this, and probably for a different reason than anybody in this room. See, in 2004, our son Eric Fabian, as an 18-year-old United States Marine, was sent to the country of Iraq, combat duty in a region called the Triangle of Death. And after 7 months of combat, he returned, but he still has physical and emotional scars from that duty. And the reason we all know these men were sent there was for energy in the form of crude oil. And 15 years later, we still send our young people to the Middle East for crude oil. And projects like this that create the energy right here that's going to be used here not put in a tanker and sent around the world. These are the projects we need. And so if Apex is willing to partner with our family and put a windmill or wind turbine on our property, we're willing to do that, so maybe it will keep some other family from seeing their son or daughter sent to these foreign lands for energy when we can produce it right here.
So pretty gripping, pretty emotional stuff, and I'm delighted to see that that project's going forward and that Mr. Fabian's going to have a part of it. So all these materials that you see here and much more is collected on a webpage, wind101.info, not .com, not .net. It's wind101.info. And I have to apologize. I've been doing a facelift on that site. It's a little rough around the edges. And I meant to have that done by tonight, but I think some of you might have heard it's been a little hectic in Midland County lately. So I got set back a few days. But there's a lot of material that's going to be there for you to review and I hope share with others who may have questions. So with that, I'm going to kind of draw that part of this to a close, and then maybe we can go to Q&A. And Kathy Jo, I'm thinking maybe I'll keep sharing the screen in case I have a resource or something that I can throw up in response to a question. But at this point, we're sort of in the free play part of the presentation. So anybody that wants to jump in, please do.
So anybody, if you have a question, remember you can click on the chat at the bottom of your screen and type your message in, and I will read it to Peter so he can answer it. While people are typing, maybe. Peter, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you last night because I liked your answer. I didn't know what it was going to be before that, but why do you do this?
Well, I think I mentioned before, I'm an independent videographer. I'm a consultant in these issues. This is a little bit more than a job for me. It's a calling. It's a vocation. I'm fortunate that I'm able to derive some income, as I said, as a consultant. But many, many years ago, when I was a teenager, my family was involved in siting issues around a very large nuclear plant that was proposed for here inside the city limits of Midland. In fact, would have been right pretty much in the floodplain of the area that was recently inundated. So that was a long process where I was able to kind of listen in and follow to hearing rooms here in Michigan, courtrooms in Chicago, and all the way to the Supreme Court in Washington, and as well as Atomic Energy Commission hearing rooms. So over about a 15-year period, I consider that to be kind of my advanced degree in all things related to energy and the economics and politics that goes into it. And I've since followed all those issues pretty closely through the media. And so I have, I think, a reasonable understanding of how these various technologies have evolved and where they're going. And many people have told me that they find my insights useful. So I started making my first videos about solar and wind energy 10 years ago, long before anybody was ever paying me for it. Because simply I felt it was the direction that we had to go. And this is what gets me out of bed in the morning, is that I love Michigan. I want us to lead the world. in this century like we did in the last century. I got kids. I want them to have prospects for the same kind of a livable planet that I've been so blessed to grow up on. And so that's why I do this work.
Well, that's awesome. I can tell you my phone was blowing up during this with people saying, wow, this is really good. We do have some questions though. First question is from Russ. How does a wind project generate additional income for local governments and their divisions? Is it just through personal property taxes or other?
Okay, I think we're talking about having some further presentations where we can get into more detail on that. And your mileage may vary community to community depending on what your millage structure is. And in every community, the local supervisory boards will have to take stock of how best to capture those revenue streams. But essentially, there are payments to landowners who host the turbines. There are payments called so-called participation agreements for members of the community. In many cases, I believe that will be the. Am I right, Albert? There will be participation agreements here.
Yes. Yeah, and it's kind of without going too deep into the weeds on what some of the plans are with the Montcalm wind project specifically. It is a community-focused or community-based lease, so anybody who participates would essentially sign the exact same agreement as the next person. So everybody you'd be treated fairly and sign the same deal. So there would be annual payments made per the terms of the lease, essentially for participating.
Okay, so and so there are regular county taxes on the value of the turbines, and there are, so whatever your regular millages are, and there are millages through like the intermediate school district in whatever area you're in that are generally captured for, say, the school's usage. So there's a number of different kind of levels and mechanisms where that money flows out into the community. And then, of course, during the construction process, you've got wages being paid. You've got people in town who are working and buying things and staying in hotels and eating in restaurants. And so there's a whole range of ways in which revenues flow into local communities.
Thank you, Peter. We have another question from Kevin. My family is new to this. We are in Montcalm County. We are in the planning stages here. What are things my family and other farmers need to be doing now to help inform people in our county to help reduce tension in our county? Not sure if there will be any.
Right. Well, first of all, you can, I hope you will consider me a resource that is available to you anytime. And I realize we're in sort of difficult, we're all in COVID time right now. I get that. But I'm technically, I'm computer literate, and I have a cell phone, and I can jump on a Zoom or a Skype, and I will talk to one person, two person, or 500 people. Makes no difference to me. Just let me know. And of course, we've got the win101.info resource page. And again, I'm going to apologize. I'm giving it a facelift. It's going to look a whole lot better in a few days. But all of these things that you see here and a whole lot more is there. There is also a Wind 101 Facebook page. Okay, so you got win101.info, and then on Facebook there is a Wind 101 page, and I would encourage you all to go there and like that and follow that. And it's very instructive because what you'll see there is I keep posting positive stuff or informative stuff like what you have seen here. And we get a whole lot of the sort of trollish activity that that we expect. And what you will see is like there's the same, maybe half a dozen at most people who will like be coming back again and again and again and again, posting and reposting the same cartoons and Facebook factoids and all this kind of stuff. And I pretty much just ignore them. I'm not into getting into arguments. I just keep posting more positive and informative material there. And so that's a very frequently fresh, updating resource, Wind 101 on Facebook, in addition to the wind101.info. But please don't be shy about reaching out to contact me. And how best can we like give everybody, you know, maybe I can type my email in so people can have that, or what's the best way to share that?
We can send that out after, Kathy Jo can send out your contact info after this is over. How's that?
Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Okay. We have another question here from Ada Whale. Thanks, Peter, for a great presentation. We have quite a few of those up here, as a matter of fact. So what is the scenario with the cost of renewable energy, wind inclusive, without subsidy? I'm not sure what these acronyms are, but I'm ITC and PTC. While fossil fuels keep getting subsidized, is the grid parity still likely?
Well, if by grid parity you mean, you know, renewables are at a competitive level, that we're there, you know, we're there. And we still have, it's a very interesting situation that we're in, especially with the COVID pandemic. Everything is up in the air, everything is up for grabs, but utilities are, electrical demand is down. And so, as I mentioned before, they want to use more and more solar and wind because the fuel cost is free. And it's a great advantage for them at this time. Going forward, the biggest competitors for solar and wind, the biggest competitor is still natural gas. The problem that the natural gas industry has is that they have not been making money for the last decade. They drill and they drill and they drill, and they don't make profits. And if you follow the financial press, like the Wall Street Journal, you'll know that this is true. A lot of natural gas companies are on the verge of bankruptcy, and probably we'll see many bankruptcies coming out of this corona crisis. So they're in a rock and a hard place because they can't go cheaper because they're already losing their shirts, so they can't go cheaper. But if they go more expensive, then the renewables are going to eat them alive because that competition is so intense right now. And solar came down another substantial percentage just in the last year in price. Wind came down something like, correct me if I'm wrong, Albert, I think it was 4 or 5% in the last year. I think solar came down something like 10%. That sounds about the right range. So they're still dropping because the renewables are following the path, just like you learned in Econ 101 or a high school economics class. The more we build these things, we have a learning curve. Engineers are really good at what they do, and so mass production just keeps bringing prices down and down. And we're about to go into a really explosive stage of growth for electric vehicles, where there are going to be many, many, many more battery storage units in the form of these electric vehicles. There will be essentially a huge storage battery in everyone's garage in about 5 years. And so that's going to make the renewables even more compelling in that new paradigm of the web of storage and generation and transmission of energy, because utilities will be able to have so many options for moving electricity around from the places that are generating it to the places that are storing it, and even a lot of options for companies to raise or lower their electric demand because we're getting much better at that kind of very tight computerized control of demand. So every projection that you see shows renewable prices continuing to drop, and coal is pretty much out of the picture, because to build a new coal plant, you're now looking at prices that are simply no longer competitive, assuming you don't want to continue putting lead and mercury and arsenic and all kinds of other stuff into the environment. If you're going to build in controls to control that pollution, which they didn't 50, 60 years ago, then coal is simply no longer competitive, and it's an industry that's going to die like buggy whips. So that's sort of the 50,000 foot view. I mean, we could slice it a lot finer than that, but I don't think you're going to find a whole lot of argument that renewables are going to only become more mainstream going forward.
Thank you, Peter. Got a couple other questions here. One of them I'm going to handle. It was a second question. Will the recording be available, accessible afterwards? It will be available to view, but it will not be available to download. There are some things in there that were some of the speakers don't want their stuff out there. It's not Peter who doesn't want it out there. It's they don't want their own stuff. They don't mind people watching it, but they don't want other people broadcasting it, if that makes sense. They want control of their own ideas. Another question, Travis, I've got your question here, and I'm actually going to cover that at the very end. Thank you for your question. Here's one question we have that came in anonymously. Peter, when you travel across the state or talk with different people about their experiences with renewable energy, what is the most impactful thing that you've learned?
Well, the most impactful thing to me is that when I first got started in this, and I knew there was a fair amount of controversy out there, so I had genuine questions about how people on the ground in the communities were actually experiencing their day-to-day interactions with say wind turbines and increasingly solar energy and things like that. And what has been a very pleasant surprise is to find out how minimal or positive those impacts generally are, overwhelmingly. That's been true of just about everybody I've talked to in the wind communities, but particularly people who are in positions of some knowledge and responsibility. You know, people who would have their ear to the ground and hear things if there were like negative reports and stuff like that. So I guess I've just been more and more just gratified to hear that, in fact, these technologies are not only very, very benign and very accepted neighbors, they're creating opportunities in communities. And this is a key insight that I've had. When I don't think it's a secret for you folks in Montcalm County, but when you drive across rural Michigan, a lot of communities are flat on their backs. They've been hollowed out over the last 30 years by the loss of manufacturing jobs and you know, in a lot of farming communities, that person in the family who's got the job that kind of keeps the financial things running. A lot of times that person has lost that job, or they haven't been able to get as good a job in the last few decades as they would have 30, 40 years ago. And these turbines are coming in and creating the opportunity for places like, you know, Huron County to to be adding to and beefing up their school system and adding like actual world-class recreation facilities and teaching facilities. And Gratiot County, my conversation with Jan Amsterberg in Gratiot County has been really fascinating, because I'm married to a teacher and I value education. My mom was an English teacher before she got involved in a whole lot of other things. And so I can't imagine a more powerful and absolutely vital foundation for rebuilding Michigan than rebuilding our schools. And the wind turbines and renewable energy offer that kind of funding where these rural communities and if you're lucky enough to have been born in a small town in Michigan, you know what that's like to grow up in this beautiful place that we share. Having the opportunity to create good educational programs for young people so that people feel they can stay in their communities. I think a lot of young people would like to stay in their communities and not feel like they have to leave. And the renewable energy is, I think, making that possible. And that's one of the things that Sarah Mills' research kind of underlines too, is that younger people are starting to feel like, maybe I can make it here. Maybe I can stay in this place. Maybe communities can stay together and families can stay together and farmers can remain the stewards of the land, you know, which is so important to me. And so just all these things all kind of put together, it makes me feel like there's an opportunity here to reinvent Michigan and reinvent the Midwest and kind of by bringing more economic power back into the communities so that people really feel a sense that they can self-determine, that they can determine their own destinies.
That's awesome. Thank you. One last question before we wrap up.
Sure.
There's got to be some downside. What are some of the downsides you've learned about throughout your travels and talking to people?
Well, I mean, one of the downsides, it's so ironic, is that the antis will come into a community and they'll say, wind energy is going to divide your community. And then they set about to create division in the community, you know, and it's a real, it's kind of a walk through psychology 101, you know, to see this dynamic at work. But that's really, you know, one of the saddest things that I've seen. And I'm hoping that with the good information that we're putting out, that and simply by people's exposure to the actual experience to being around this stuff, I think this is what is happening. I think this is what I'm seeing, is that more people are just simply learning that the horror stories that they see on Facebook and this terrible initiative to divide people is really, it's kind of a sideshow, and we don't need to get too involved in it.
So are you expecting us to believe that not everything we read on Facebook is true?
I would just say, you know, trust God, but tie your camels.
Okay. Okay, so now as we wrap up, I'm going to start with Travis's question. Travis is actually from the right place, represents Ionia County, and is Kathy Jo's boss in all this. So he says, great info all around. From an economic development standpoint, are there any statistics as to the multiplier effect of wind projects in a community, such as every dollar invested in a wind project, it results in X dollars of investment in other parts of the economy, job creation, other businesses, ventures? The reason that Travis asked that is that because when you look at base jobs in manufacturing, basically manufacturing and agriculture being base jobs, every dollar invested in those returns $2.50 in other investment. Studies have borne that out as we go through. What I'll tell you there, Travis, is the MEA, the Economic Alliance, voted just this week to commission a study with the Upjohn Institute, because one of the questions is, what are all of the benefits that do come to a community that brings in one of these projects? And so, some of them might be harder to quantify than others. So what we're doing is, hopefully we'll have the study done by, or the Upjohn Institute will have it done by August, but it's looking at what the benefits are to a community so we can actually quantify what all those are. As far as we know, there's been no other study like this done, so it will be a first. And we'll keep you posted as we move forward on that. What I can tell you is that just base numbers, some guesstimates, numbers that have gone out in Isabella County. Theirs is going to be the largest project in Michigan. Ours is, if we get one, gosh, it would be nice, would be close to that. Probably not bigger, but close, hopefully. But in Isabella County, they're talking about $30 million in tax benefits over the life of the project, which is 25 to 30 years. And close to $100 million in direct landowner payments over that same life of the project. So that's a lot of money that flows into the community. But, maybe there's other things, and that's what that Upjohn study is going to look at as we move forward. To finish up, I wanted to let you know that we talked about let's say a Wind 201 session that we're doing in June. That June session is going to focus more on the nuts and bolts of ordinances. Not quite as exciting as what we saw today, but we'll be talking, more legal things of what townships need to look at when it comes time, and their, what are the setbacks, other things that they want to think about, because we're going to want, across the county, we're going to want similar statutes, because it makes it much easier for developers to come in and do their job as long as we're in the same ballpark as we go through. Also, we have the MEA has a general meeting on July 8th. Details will be coming, and during that, Keith Den Hollander, the National Field Director with the Christian Coalition, will be coming in to also talk about wind and why the Christian Coalition supports wind across the country and within Michigan. So again, I would like to thank everybody for joining us. Peter, it was great. The best comment I got all throughout the whole day about this was, I tuned in expecting to work, but it was so interesting that I actually didn't work, and I listened the whole time, which I can tell you, I saw it the day before and I still watched because it was really good. Love what you did. Thank you very much for everything you do. Kathy, Joe, anything you want to close up with, or?
Oh, just appreciate everybody attending, and I put my contact info up on the screen, so let me know if you want. I don't want to shoot this out to everybody, the link to the video, but let me know via email, and I'll gladly share it with you.
All right, everybody, thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting this, or at least listening and making up your own mind, because that's what's really important. We will sign off now. Everyone have a good night. Stay safe.
Yes, stay safe, everybody.
I am smart, baby.